So again, thank you for being here, and thank you to Lindy Villa, Shakira Smith, Ron Kaufman, Brian Clack, Noel Norton, for all your help and for giving me the opportunity to organize this series of talks. We're here again for Frontiers and Frontiers, which is sponsored by USD's Humanities Center. And we're going to listen to practitioners from a variety of disciplines, as we did last week, as they describe their strategies in assessing the real and potential ecologies, architectures, economies, and relations of our borderlands. Last week, we heard from Ariel Prado of Innovation Law Lab, in conversation with which organization I kind of developed these panels. After hearing from him about some of the ways in which the carceral response to migration really harms the very populations it purports to protect, we also heard from Evelyn Cruz in theater, Kate Boersma in biology, and Peter Neck in political economy. And we generated some sense of the kind of valuable and unique ecosystem from Kate, from Dr. Boersma, of Imperial Valley. We listened to an example of how applied theater resists trauma mining. And we had an introduction to the cost-benefit equation used by authorities when determining policies and practices that are supposed to deter migrants and international workers from wanting to be here. Students, in the meantime, as of last week, have begun to think about how to reweight that equation and are thinking about mapping spaces of community engagement. I've met a few people, community engagement in Imperial Valley, assessing what kinds of economies exist there that could be bolstered instead of reinforcing the economy of a prison, right? And speculating about what they can imagine would reweight the equation that puts the onus of this global scenario on the most vulnerable. So that was a really exciting thing to begin to talk to students about. And again, as last week, I'm here to acknowledge that we're speaking from the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay people. And again, I hope that you hear in that invocation of a past that is very present for us, a chance to think broadly about the future, how it's organized, what it looks like, who lives where, and how. So today, in this order, we are lucky to hear from Dr. Brian Clack, who's in USD philosophy and also our absolute director of the Humanities Center. We'll be speaking a bit about surveillance and kind of a history that we can use, as we then hear from Ersela Kripa, Texas, who teaches at Texas Tech College of Architecture in El Paso and also runs POST, Project for Operative Spatial Technologies. And then we'll hear from Amy Sanchez-Arteaga and Misael Diaz of Cognate Collective. So we're going to learn a little bit more about the strategies for unpacking sort of bureaucratic states and modalities for engaging with international workers and residents as well as humans, right? So Dr. Clack, you are up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clara. This is a great series. I'm really happy to be part of it. I'm just going to share my screen here. How is that? Is that working? Good. Good. So probably the most dramatic intersection of the reality of prison and the activity of philosophy lies in the concept of the Panopticon, advanced at the end of the 18th century by the British philosopher, legal theorist, and founder of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham. Here he is. The case of Bentham is a rather strange one. He was a progressive thinker and one whose work focused on beneficial reforms of society aimed at the increased happiness and pleasure of society's members. In his person, is a rather whimsical character, and his concern for animals showed itself both in his love for his pet cat, fabulously named the Reverend Dr. John Langhorne, and more seriously in his inclusion of animals within the proper circle of moral concern. This is actually worth noting in the context of our discussion today. In a footnote to his important book, An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, Bentham stresses how appallingly non-human animals have been treated throughout ages and cultures. The day may come, he says, when the rest of the animal creation may acquire those rights which never could have been withholden from them but by the hand of tyranny. He then considers the standard arguments that are commonly put forward to deny moral status to animals. We know these arguments well. Animals cannot think, they cannot speak, they cannot reason. Bentham rejects all of these in an important way. A full-grown horse, he says, or dog, is beyond comparison a more rational, as well as a more conversable animal than an infant of a day or a week or even a month old. But suppose the case were otherwise, what would it avail? The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Now, I want to say no more here about the question of animals, and simply note this passage in order to stress something that will concern us when we come to address Bentham's view of the prison, namely his sensitivity to suffering and his desire to minimize pain. Now, all of this, one might think, would give Bentham a rather soft and cuddly reputation. But in certain quarters, at least, he is perceived as a sinister figure, as a cruel enthusiast for incarceration, and as the architect of the modern surveillance state. Now, this other Bentham, the sinister Bentham, would appear to be the result, I think, of two things. The first is of less direct concern to us today, but still worth noting. You know, always keen that things should be of use to society, hence utilitarian, Bentham arranged for his body after death to be publicly dissected so as to advance anatomical knowledge. Here's this image of Bentham on the dissecting table. This dissection took place in the Webb School of Anatomy in London in rather Gothic conditions. A thunderstorm raged outside as it took place. And the remains of his body were then preserved and put on display in the form of what Bentham would famously call an auto-icon, a lasting emblem of himself, better than any statue or portrait. Bentham's preserved body has for many decades sat in the cloisters of University College London. This is what it used to look like on the left. And just last year, it's been put in this shiny new display case and housed prominently in UCL's new student center. I kind of disapprove of the modern version. But we'll have reason to return to the scene of Bentham's public dissection later. Oh, by the way, this photo is of Bentham in America. He's always traveling around, even though he's dead. Now, more than the oddities of Bentham's uncanny afterlife, it is his articulation and advocacy of the ideal prison, what he called the Panopticon, that has secured for him a sinister reputation. Bentham's ideas concerning punishment and detention are the practical outgrowth of two central elements of his moral philosophy. First of all, the connection between good behavior and vigilance. And secondly, the idea of pain as mischief. Now we'll start with the first of these. In his writings on the Poor Laws, written in 1797, Bentham says this: I do really take it for an indisputable truth, and a truth that is one of the cornerstones of political science. The more strictly we are watched, the better we behave. Now look, this is not the most original of thoughts. It could be said, in fact, that the entirety of Plato's classic work, The Republic, is a response to a similar claim, namely the claim expressed in the story of the Ring of Gyges, the claim that any person who had the power to become invisible would invariably behave worse than they do when visible, and that accordingly, it is only fear of detection that stops us from behaving badly. Now, Bentham's not actually advancing such a radical claim. He is not saying that moral behavior is simply born from a fear of punishment. He's purely observing that we behave better when we are being watched. Or more correctly, we behave better when we believe or feel that we may be being watched. And it's that intuition that is put to work by Bentham in his advocacy of the Panopticon. This is the title page of the 1791 edition of the Panopticon, and the title spells out the essence of his scheme. You can read it here: Panopticon, or the inspection house, containing the idea of a new principle of construction applicable to any sort of establishment in which persons of any description are to be kept under inspection, and in particular to penitentiary houses, prisons, poorhouses, lazarettos, houses of industry, manufactories, hospitals, workhouses, madhouses, and schools, etc. Now, early on in the book, before sketching the architectural structure of his proposed inspection house, Bentham notes the theoretical basis of his project. He says this is what he says: "It is obvious that in all these instances, the more constantly the persons to be inspected are under the eyes of the persons who should inspect them, the more perfectly will the purpose of the establishment have been attained. Ideal perfection, if that were the object, would require that each person should actually be in that predicament during every instant of time. This being impossible, the next thing to be wished for is that at every instant, seeing reason to believe as much and not being able to satisfy himself to the contrary, he should conceive himself to be so." Bentham thus presented the model of the Panopticon as the solution to this problem of practicality and ideality. The Panopticon is designed so that while not all prisoners are in fact being observed, it appears to them as though they might be. So the architecture or plans of the prison makes this the case. Here's one of the plans of the Panopticon. Here's another one. As you can see in the plan, the building is circular. The cells of the prisoners occupy the circumference. The cells are divided from one another, making communication between the prisoners impossible, nor can the prisoners see one another. There is no opportunity for plotting or for collective and rebellious plans. The apartment of the prison inspector occupies the center of the building. Bentham calls this the inspector's lodge. Bentham goes into great detail about this, by the way. By a specific arrangement of light, windows, and Venetian blinds, the whole is arranged so that no prisoner can see the precise whereabouts of the inspector in the lodge. Each prisoner will then suspect that they are being watched, though always uncertain of the fact. Bentham says this: "You will please to observe that the persons to be inspected should always feel themselves as if under inspection." You should note there the as if principle at work. This is an important point that we'll come back to. Now, Michel Foucault, in his important book, Discipline and Punish, there's an essay in there called Panopticism. He refers to Bentham's Panopticon as a machine. It's an interesting line: a machine for dissociating the sea being seen dyad. In the peripheric ring, one is totally seen without ever seeing. In the central tower, one sees everything without ever being seen. Now, what we see in the design of the Panopticon, therefore, is a fascinating reversal of the optical centering found in such buildings as stadiums and theatres in the round. in which, once the auditorium lights are dimmed, the actors on the stage can be seen by the audience, while the audience cannot be seen by the actor. And there's another example of this. We can consider the anatomical theatre. This wasn't the one that Bentham was dissected in, but it gives you the idea. Here, the importance of the extreme visibility of what lies in the center of the theatre is vital. The audience sees Bentham's body. They see Bentham's body indeed at its greatest level of exposure, dissected, the inner brought out to view. Nothing in the center is hidden from those at the circumference, while the object at the center sees nothing, in this case, because he's dead, of course. Now, the Panopticon reverses this entirely. The center of the building is a mystery to those at its circumference. The inspector's lodge is, as Bentham puts it, an utterly dark spot. Now, this is going to give the impression to each prisoner that they are always under constant surveillance, even when they're not. We are dealing, therefore, with the value of appearance, with what Bentham calls the apparent omnipresence of the inspector. Now, this language that he uses is theological, and that's not accidental, since Bentham recognizes the power, the psychological impact of belief in an omnipotent, omniscient being, even if that being doesn't exist. Bentham recognizes, that is, the regulative and behavioral importance of an invisible and all-seeing eye, an eye which, in the words of Jacques-Alain Miller, is, and I quote, looking at me, even when it does not see me. Now, in this context, it's worth noting images used by Bentham as ideas for a frontispiece to his book. Here they are. Now, you can see the great trinity of divine ideals surrounding the all-seeing eye: mercy, justice, and vigilance. Note that vigilance is in capital letters. In his sketch for this final image, Bentham had used words from the Psalms, which are at the top of that slide. Thou art about my path and about my bed, and spiest out all my ways. There's loads to be said there, which we haven't got time, tragically, to talk about. Bentham's idea of the omniscient God here is invoked not as a stern judge, actually, but as a constant companion, leading wayward souls back to the path of virtue because they're being watched. You know, Bentham was so enamored by the idea of the Panopticon that he saw it as a model not merely for prisons, but for such institutions as schools, hospitals, and factories. And with regard to factories, one might think here of surveillance in those huge Amazon warehouses. It's perhaps the model for an entire society. This is what he says. What would you say, this is the last words of his essay on the Panopticon, what would you say if by the gradual adoption and diversified application of this single principle, you should see a new scene of things spread out, spread itself over the face of civilized society, morals reformed, health preserved, industry invigorated, instruction diffused, public burdens lightened, economy seated, as it were upon a rock, the Gordian knot of the poor laws, not cut but untied, all by a simple idea in architecture. Here, I suppose, we get the blueprint for the surveillance state, a state in which every individual going about their business is or appears to be watched, monitored. Now, it seems to me no surprise, no coincidence that the city in which Bentham lived his life, London, is now the third most heavily surveilled city in the world and the most surveilled outside of China. There are 73 surveillance cameras for every 1,000 inhabitants in London. It's an extraordinary number. it's hard to walk down even the smallest street in London without seeing a security camera. And on Benthamite principles, of course, it wouldn't even matter whether a great many of those cameras weren't functioning at all. On those principles, what really matters is not the idea of detecting the wrongdoer after a crime has been committed, but deterring those very crimes. We'll return to that shortly. Foucault, again, in his discussion of panopticism, stresses and elaborates on the frightening and inhumane elements of Bentham's project. This thing, a cruel, ingenious cage, is not just a dream building, but the diagram of a mechanism of power reduced to its ideal form. It is, in fact, a figure of political technology that may and must be detached from any specific use. Every person monitored, everyone locked up in his cage. The Benthamite view found in the surveillance state is of, this incredible line in Foucault, an interrogation without end, an investigation that would be extended without limit to a meticulous and ever more analytical observation, a judgment that would at the same time be the constitution of a file that was never closed. Foucault's judgment exposes the plight of the individual, whether that individual is a prisoner in the inspection house or just a citizen in the surveillance state. He said, he is seen, but does not see. He is the object of information, never a subject in communication. So the horrors of the Panopticon idea, again, what he calls the cruel, ingenious cage. So this horror is perhaps best felt when we see images of prisons constructed along the lines of Bentham's ideas. Here, for example, is the notorious F House of Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois, which had been shuttered and was just recently reopened in order to place inmates who had contracted COVID, reopened for that purpose. And you can absorb this image along with Foucault's summary of Bentham's view of power. Bentham laid down the principle that power should be visible and unverifiable. Visible. The inmate will constantly have before his eyes the tall outline of the central tower from which he is being spied. Unverifiable. The inmate must never know whether he is being looked at any one moment. He must be sure that he may always be so. And here's a haunting image, I think, of the ruins of the Presidio Modelo prison in Cuba. You know, the fear those images might produce in us can be equaled by Bentham's rather chilling words, in a panopticon, the inspector's back is never turned. You can never do something behind the back of the person who's watching you. Now, defenders of Bentham, such as Christian Welsbacher and Janet Semple, make
Good, you? How many classes do you have?
Oh, I can hear a voice. They make the valid point that Foucault's influential and highly critical reading is in fact markedly ahistorical and decontextualized. See, at the close of the 18th century, when Bentham proposed the Panopticon model, prisons were absolutely appalling, and his work was part of a broader and humane push for prison reform. Bentham's project is an attempt to maintain some kind of moral order over people who may behave badly if unobserved. That's what he thinks of as realism. While at the same time, he wants prison to act not as an agent of retribution and punishment, but simply as an organ of deterrence. I'll say a quick word about this. Farah, do I have time, or do you want me to just pause there?
You know, I think if you have a way to wrap up that makes sense to you, that's good. But if you, I won't go into the logic of deterrence here. We can come back to it if necessary.
One of the things that Bentham thinks will happen is that even the observers of the prisoners, they themselves should be under observation. So there's no temptation for them to do wrongly. They should, he says, be constantly accessible to the great tribunal committee of the world. So again, just return to that final principle, which how one feels about Bentham will turn to some extent on your acceptance of that Benthamite principle. Done.
Thank you, Brian. Dr. Clack. Wonderful. I had no idea that his body was on view in the college. Awful. Ersela.
Hey, should I jump in?
Yeah.
All right, I will share my screen as well. I have two machines, so just want to make sure I can do this. You can see my full screen?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so I'm an architect and also an educator, but there will be no design work talked about today because it's a really difficult context to design in without actually dismantling the securocratic regimes. So this is who I am, and I kind of just wanted to share with you that this is my daily commute in El Paso. This is actually me filming while my partner is driving, and so this is the border fence that was actually extended in 2006. It's about 57 miles that ended up being built by 2008 along the channelized Rio Grande River, which serves as the international boundary. So you're seeing Ciudad Juarez on the side, and they are kind of situated across the riverbed. And I kind of just wanted to give you this as a context of the kind of jarring infrastructure that if someone were to actually jump the fence, they face an impassable infrastructural chasm where there is rail, there are highways, and then there is enormous topography. And so this entire area of the border fence is essentially expanded through these infrastructures of prohibiting humans crossing. So what we've been doing while we're here is we've been trying to essentially broadcast and map and show the world these kinds of injustices that infrastructure and kind of spatial arrangements create. So this is a series of border dispatches, but I wanted to kind of focus on the privatized migrant detention network and kind of system in the United States. Before Trump's election, things were a little bit more kind of accessible. And so we were able to visit many detention centers and photograph them and interview the people who run them. And so we were lucky to have access. And then after that, as you know, especially summer 4 or 5 summers ago, then even congressional representatives could not even enter because they were trying to hide what they were doing. But even in 2009, the Department of Homeland Security investigated itself and determined and was kind of sort of surprised at itself that facilities that ICE uses to detain this word aliens were built and actually operate as jails and as prisons. And so these standards seem to treat migrants as common criminals. And so many of the sites of the detention, as we all know, are now privately operated by firms and individuals who actually came up through the penal system. So many of the people who run the immigration detention centers are people who have run also detention centers. With this profit-driven model, actually selected sites are becoming more and more highly specified in order to capitalize on a market and in this network of nodes in the national business of deportation, which has proven to be highly lucrative. So one of the sites we've been able to visit has become a glorified departure gate for a secretive airline shuttle service that is run by Customs and Border Patrol and sends about 160 detainees home on each of 3 scheduled flights a week. And home is a loosely used word. Sometimes they're all sent to Mexico, even if they don't come from Mexico. But the organizers who run this place describe the success of the architecture in being able to process not what they call people, but bodies in large numbers in this kind of efficient manner. So this is the schedule of the flights at any day of the week. And so they are built in prisons and using prison logics. So they're built very close by other prisons, rendering this architectural type complicit in the inhumane treatment of migrants. And so we see spaces like these and spaces like these for people who have a sort of an international right guaranteed to seek asylum. And they are also really proud that they allow about 60 minutes of daylight, whereas other prisons only allow 30 minutes. And so this seems like a big win for them. And so part of what was happening with the Trump administration is this illegal practice right here that you see, which is the software of this hardened infrastructure. You see the Border Patrol agents here on the left who are stopping people at the international boundary before they reach the port of entry. This is in El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. This is the international bridge near downtown. And what they're doing is they're essentially blocking people from reaching the port of entry where they have their right to seek asylum. And so this is highly illegal, and it's been brought up to the Geneva Convention, and nothing has been done. But so we heard it through chatter, we were able to photograph it and broadcast it, and this made it to Amnesty's desk, and I'll talk about that later. And so, but part of what we're interested in also is this kind of the hardening of border infrastructure and privatized walls and privatized kind of securocratic armatures to control immigration. This is Steve Bannon's private wall that was built in El Paso. It was built in 3 weeks and really quickly without environmental impact analyses and without giving people a chance to protest. And so here we are, and it was built on a 60-foot deep fill. It filled the beautiful arroyo, which was a delicate kind of desert ecology. And where it ends is actually abuts the IBWC, the International Boundary Water Commission's dam, which is the international dam, the American dam that channelizes the Rio Grande water between Mexican and American farms. And so you see it here where the brown fence meets the silver. The silver is federal property. And so now there's disputes between federal workers and this privatized wall. And so what we were really interested in are the tools of architecture and the tools of construction. So we did some digging and we realized that Fisher Industries, which is the builder of this wall, goes out on Fox News all the time, has been really filing many patents. So they're seeing patenting and methods of construction as another lucrative offshoot of building the wall itself. And so these patents are actually designed to build it faster, cheaper, and better. And this is us modeling it and kind of like trying to understand the logics of how this wall was able to be built so quickly and destroy so many lives, kind of, becoming part of the surveillance. It has a 16-foot wide sidewalk where Border Patrol cars can actually drive up the mountain. And so there's just many issues here, but the idea was to talk about this in terms of cautioning designers to not use these methods that have been designed with really kind of exclusionary goals in mind. And so we've been working with Amnesty International a little bit through the kind of the projected photography that we were sending out to the world. This is in 2020, in the summer of the pandemic. The idea was that there was a report by Amnesty that they wanted to visualize the dangerous overcrowding and mismanagement of federal and private immigration detention facilities, which actually contributed to a disproportionate rates of COVID-19 in the areas. And so mining documents from Amnesty that were recently obtained from a Freedom of Information Act request, we were able to confirm, geolocate, and categorize about 200 federally operated detention facilities in the US. And you kind of see this map is interactive online, and if you hover over, you see their capacity versus how many people they're actually detaining. And the Amnesty report was really advocating for releasing migrants into their communities while their paperwork is being processed so that they wouldn't have to be contracting COVID. And so when you zoom into the map, then we actually start to see the sort of like the architecture of these areas out in the desert. And so I kind of wanted to just close by zooming out to understand that the securocratic regimes that control at the very local level here on the binational kind of valley of the border are really informed and empowered by a global kind of militarization of space, but also of the far-reaching of securocratic regimes. So this is our kind of the latest collection of our work, and we were essentially looking at kind of the military simulated environments and urban kind of warfare training environments built by the U.S. military or co-opting existing cities in order to train for urban warfare. And so as we've kind of cataloged all of these, we've been able to find about 500 and have been able to map them, and they will become available online for anyone to see soon, geolocated. But what we're seeing is that while they're building, they're actually also co-opting existing cities that have gone, that have emptied out. So former mining towns and areas like this and company towns completely empty out. These buildings are rented or bought by the DoD in order to train. And so this conflation of understanding a militarization of an urban space through the lens of existing city fabrics is incredibly troublesome. And so here are some of the spaces. So cataloging them, it's important to understand the architectural typologies. And as we're looking at the architectural typologies, we're understanding that they are increasingly, the US military is increasingly modeling what are called informal environments and their institutions. So mosques show up, specific self-settled villages, dumps, shanty towns, as they call them, refugee camps. And so the kind of the conflation of a sort of forced displacement with self-settled environments as a way to kind of to train out a warfare surveillance technique is really troublesome. And it's what we've kind of been really preoccupied with, because in order to be architects and to operate in this environment, we feel that we need to first catalog and dismantle and understand these systems. So from this, these large, the secretive urban simulation sites have actually propagated and evolved over the last several decades. This is going on since the First World War and even before, but all signs actually suggest that what we're calling a shadow urbanism will continue to spread. And so from this position on the simulated sites, which are places like these, a militaristic viewpoint of our collective urban futures is continuously absorbed, it's rehearsed, and it's ingrained, and it threatens to project back into the world with its full power. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. It's amazing to see how that initial notion of surveillance evolves into these kinds of these sites. I have questions, but let's hear from Amy and Misael first, especially since Misael, I know you have to go in about 20 minutes, so let's hand it over. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Ersela and Brian, for those presentations. Today, we want to talk about, so I think, well, maybe it's important to say, first off, that we both met and started collaborating together as Cognate Collective well, we met prior to that, but we started Cognate Collective in around 2010. And part of our work together and part of our collaboration has really been because we're both from the border. So Misael grew up crossing between San Diego and Tijuana, and I actually grew up in the Imperial Valley, and my family lives in Mexicali. And so this is an image of 2nd Street in Calexico, just across. So the wall that you see there is the international jurisdiction that separates Calexico and Mexicali. And this is a place where my family lived in the 1980s. And so I think we had this interest in thinking about the different discourses that we understood around the border, and the border as a site of like contestation and violence, and I think like a site where a lot of people move to out of sort of necessity in all this context, but also to interface that and to think about those realities in light of our experience and the kind of like quotidian dynamics and forms of resistance that communities just sort of embody in the everyday, in the face of those forms of sort of oppression and violence. And so that today what we're going to talk about is work that specifically I think makes reference to the Imperial Valley, and work that we had in a recent exhibition at Best Practice Gallery. Shout out to Joe Yordi, who I think I saw, who who invited us to do that exhibition. So we're gonna, I think, just give a kind of genealogy around that body of work, but we're also happy later to answer any questions about the practice more broadly. So do you want to start by talking about the...
I think as Amy was mentioning, one of the things that is a really important element of our work is trying to bridge the kind of macro political discourses, like macroeconomic discourses around the border, and the kind of lived experiences of communities on the ground, communities like those in which we grew up, and the experiences of families like those that we grew up in and knowing, and how it is that those two experiences of the border can speak to one another and can ultimately be part of a way of understanding the different dynamics that shape the region, and also how we could potentially push back against forms and discourses and ideologies that are structuring the border in a way that is ultimately leading to death, right? To the death of folks who are seeking to move across the border. So as a kind of juxtaposition to the first image that we began with, we also wanted to share this one, which is a site of unmarked graves, a kind of a site where unidentified remains are buried in the Imperial Valley. I think one of the things that we've become interested in is how these territories that we grew up in and these kind of just regions that are so much a part of home and have these elements of, you know, struggle, but also just joy, can also become these sites for violence, right? And these sites that are marked by these experiences of trauma and pain. And so that interest in really thinking about how these terrains and these regions can ultimately hold different experiences, both I think quotidian, you know, sites of creativity and resilience, but also sites of trauma and pain, how these regions kind of are embedded with these two different elements of life is something that we've just been interested in unpacking for ourselves. And part of the way that we have sought to do that is to really think about how it is that we are implicated within the larger discourses and structures that are leading to the militarization of the border, forms of enforcement through deterrence that ultimately lead to death, and how it is that we can ultimately recognize just our role in either putting a stop to some of those policies, or just us essentially being complicit by not standing up and voicing a kind of opposition to these structures. So when we were, this entire kind of work has taken many shapes and many forms. One of the ways that we started to do this early on in our work together was by visiting migrant shelters in Tijuana and also in Mexicali to record different experiences of border crossing. We became interested in sharing some of those testimonies through different means, including radio at ports of entry. But also something that started to happen is that we were unable to continue kind of working and operating from the kind of specificity of this territory.
Because maybe it's important to say that a lot of that work was developed at the port of entry in the San Isidro port of entry where folks were crossing. And so I think some of the initial gestures were really, really site specific. And so in that move, in that migration spatially of our practice, it became important to seek out other modalities of like undertaking that. And I think because we found ourselves living in Orange County. We found ourselves wanting to think about the sort of long shadow that the border casts through our practice. And we were working a lot in public markets and in swap meets, which is another sort of branch of our work. And so two things happened. One, we were like working with and volunteering with different immigrant rights organizations in Orange County, and thinking about different techniques for using community power and community forms of solidarity to release folks who had been detained in that time. So that was a really powerful experience. But we were also in swap meets and in these public market spaces, seeing their 7-day candles, and I guess we can. So this is a version of the installation that we were about to talk about, but we were seeing these candles that many of you have maybe seen in botanicas, and some of them have to do with, so you light the candles to sort of advocate, a lot of them have to do with like romance. So it's like bringing back a kind of like lost lover or something like this, but there's also candles that have to do with the carceral system. There's like the court date candle. So I think we became really interested in these other forms, like the kind of all hands on deck approach of community power, of invoking not just the legal system and having like kind of these community gatherings and really mobilizing like people power, but then also even through this kind of speculative practice of candle lighting, invoking a kind of spiritual, more like numinous realm to help people that are in this really precarious sort of situation. And so when we were invited to do the project that you see before you here, Regresa Mi, we started to think about this as a form, and also, again, this kind of question of site specificity being in San Diego, the way that locally this kind of industries around detaining migrant folks, the way that there was this connection through territory between the museum and the detention center. I don't know, continue.
Yeah, so one of, as Amy was sharing, we became interested in establishing a link, in a sense, between the gallery and the visitors in the gallery and these larger infrastructures of border enforcement and also of detention. As Amy was mentioning, when we were doing a residency in Santana, we became interested in how it is that the border casts this long shadow, how it is that the border is manifesting increasingly in different ways, not just here at the kind of international jurisdiction, but how it's essentially becoming a presence of everyday life for folks that are not even residing in the kind of region of the immediate specificity of the border. So thinking about the surveillance state, right, and the way that the border casts this long shadow and manifests as a presence in just the everyday lives of immigrants. And so we became interested in this other realm of border, this other kind of relationship to border through detention centers, and wanted to really use this work as an opportunity to to grant a little bit of visibility to the experience of detention, what it is to reside inside these centers, to be a detainee, to be a kind of individual contending with these massive infrastructures that are dehumanizing and violent. And so we worked with an immigrant rights organization to gain access to testimonies of individuals who were inside of the detention center. And we actually screen printed the back of the candles with a testimony by David Sanchez-Arteaga, who was an asylum seeker that was detained at the Core Cívico Mesa Detention Center. He had been detained there for almost a year. or over a year, right? At the point when
I can't remember
yeah.
but for a while.
Yeah, so over a year, and we, as Amy was sharing, screen printed the back of the candles. In the place of the prayer that you would find the prayer, we included these testimonies, but we also included a kind of invocation of this power that's essentially, I think we're imagining that we hold collectively to choose a different relationship to border, to migration, and to really invite viewers to question how it is that we're ultimately all implicated again in these larger structures of detention. So we invited individuals, the public, to light these candles, to recite the poem slash like invocation on the back of these as a way of, again, thinking about their roles in potentially shifting how it is that we regulated migration and understood the border.
Yeah, but I think also I on a sort of more effective, or like in terms of the experience of the work, I think there was it's like this small gesture that we could invite community to do, to gather around just creating a platform for discussion of some of these issues, which became really powerful. So here you see, so that's me, and you see Misael Sandoval, who's a former student of ours, for instance, who joined us, who said this kind of invocation on the back of the prayer, and then together we lit these candles in this kind of collective gesture of abolition toward ending these structures of carcerality, and that or were you done with what you were saying? Yeah, and I think this project became, so in the time of the pandemic, this project really became important. Do you want to show, maybe we can show the image of the candles? Yeah, that one. So this project became a really like something that we thought about and that felt powerful. I think like the kind of performative space that this authored, and the gathering space that it authored, was something that felt really enabling in our practice and dialogue. And so when 2020 happened and we were in this context of a pandemic, and we were thinking about the repercussions and the effects that COVID was having, not just like in our own lives, and like in all of our lives, and this kind of global, clear, it's like a pandemic, so for everybody. But I think thinking about how that intersected with incarcerality, and this idea of like self-implication and grief is something that kept returning. And so I think something that I kept thinking about, or like a kind of mantra in making this body of work, was thinking about grief as a kind of portal, and thinking about grief and how grief was tied to memory. And so in terms of a material inspiration, or a material context for those ideas, we started thinking about wax, and the way that wax, as it's been linked historically to sort of ideas of memory, and but also like as something that holds fire, and the kind of the political power around fire. These all became things that were important. And at the same time, we were also thinking about family histories, well, I think for both of our families, but thinking about like my great-grandfather, who was an organizer with the UFW in the Imperial Valley in the 70s and 80s. So thinking about like this history and this really personal connection to wax and to the medium of wax, and the way that that also connected us to, interestingly, this kind of like non-human living things that are also ancestors, like bees and condors and grapes and other parts of the sort of agricultural economy of the Imperial Valley. And I think that landscape for my family as a landscape that was one of, like I think as Misael mentioned, right, of nurturing and of so much like love in this context that was so formative for me. The fact that that could then become, or was something that other people now experience as this like incredibly this landscape for violence, right? So I think thinking about the duality of that. Oh, I see that something came up in the chat. Oh, okay, bye. In this piece, what we decided to do, or for this piece, what we decided to do, thinking about all of that, was we created an installation that was full of candles. So we made like 200 candles, and we worked with bee farmers from the Imperial Valley. So shout out to Victor Sanchez from Sanchez Bees, and with bee farmers from Ensenada and from Northern San Diego County to source raw beeswax. And we made this series of candles that, and I also think that part of what was really like important about it for us is that these are binational bees just inherently, because so many of them are being kept like near the border, and bees like don't care about borders. And because, you know, I think like that, and that spirit, I think that spirit and the way that they fly and they move and they collaborate is also something that we just really love about this as a material in terms of this production. And so we ended up using 188 of them in the sculptural work that is central to this piece, that reflect the number of migrant deaths in the desert in the first part of 2021, right?
Mhm.
And then we also created so a candle that we made entirely sort of from scratch. So we screen printed it and then also filled it with beeswax to create this installation. And alongside that, we hung pieces that reflected, so this is an image of the public that's being invited to light the candles. I was just going to go through and do the descriptive part, and then maybe we can do more of the discursive. So we hung family stories on these materials that are also really tied. So my grandfather was a textile vendor and somebody who created these textiles for people to embroider. So we took up this form and literally wrote out by hand these family stories. And Misael's grandfather or great grandfather is somebody who made thread. So I think also thinking about the sort of lineage of like my family as somebody who made this kind of substrate for embroidery, and Misael's family making thread to embroider things. I think these just became threads of thinking about linking our family histories of migration and our family histories of resistance to contemporary issues of the kind of like deprivation, right? Like the illegality of people being denied the right to seek asylum, to move through the Americas. And I think, I think trying to also just like conjure and create this important connection between that historical and this contemporary moment, and provide this sort of site of gathering to honor that loss and that form of collective grief. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, and just the final element of the installation was also a sound component. As I mentioned, part of the work that we have done throughout just our practice is collect testimonies of folks that have crossed the border, that are in detention, that are dealing with different aspects relating to the kind of infrastructures of border enforcement, and to broadcast those on pirate radio. So if you were in and around the gallery, you would actually be able to tune your radio to 87.9 and listen to some of these stories and some of these experiences that have to do with crossing through this terrain that, as Amy was saying, is a site of home, but also has been increasingly weaponized. And I think, again, thinking through that duality and that evolution of the border is something that we've been interested in doing as a way of questioning what is driving that change, that kind of evolution, and how it is that we can ultimately become better stewards, I guess, of this region in terms of how it is that we can intervene upon these larger discourses by being, I think, more and more aware of how it is that these regions already kind of contain these histories of migration and just like an innate understanding of what it means to move and to exist as communities in ways that don't respond to the kind of logics of border. So I think we wanted to yeah, share a little bit of that through the sound elements, which you can find on our SoundCloud if you're interested in listening to it.
Yeah.
So I think we will end there.
Thank you. Do you have to run, Misael?
Yeah, so I can log on from the
Yeah, I
other
can.
room.
Yeah, if you want to log on, and I can stick around for as long as I can stick around.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Have a good class. And that's great to know that it's on SoundCloud as well. All right, students, all, I think we have time for about like 10, 15 minutes of questions. So you have at your kind of disposal the, wide swatch here of possibilities of questions of how one might dismantle a system, a carceral system. Here comes Amy. What strategies you've heard about that you want to know more about in terms of how that might happen. Any of those kinds of questions. Here's the SoundCloud link in the chat. Thank you so much. Okay. I know, I'm curious, I can start. I'm curious, and I'll give Amy a chance to kind of get herself situated. So I'll ask Ersela, first, before I even get into questions about this border, I know you grew up in Albania, right? And I wonder, Amy and Misael were just talking about their really personal connection to this border, but I wonder if your experience of, securocratic statehood and borders there that are still shifting, really, I think even I was hearing about it last year, questions of merging with Kosovo. Is that an entry point for you into working with dismantling a securocratic state here and now?
Wow, yeah, thank you. That never comes up.
It never comes up, or it comes up a lot?
It doesn't, no.
Oh, really? Okay, I'm super interested.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you. Well, so I grew up up to my adolescence in communist dictatorship, and so that was, and we were in a politically persecuted family, which meant we had spies. Like our neighbors were spies, my friends were spies, everyone was a spy. So we were constantly watching what we're saying, what I'm reading, what I'm telling my friends that we watched last night on TV, and so there's that paranoia that has never left me, even though I've been out of the country for so long. And then at the fall of communism, I fled Albania like many people my age did, with my brother. And so we were refugees in Greece, jumped the border illegally, and we were undocumented migrants for 3.5 years. And so as we were doing that, we were also kind of like hiding. So if I'd see my brother on the street, we wouldn't speak Albanian to each other. We were baptized so that we can have Greek Orthodox names because we were Muslim, and so we were not welcome, and I couldn't go to school. And so constantly hiding my identity and constantly sort of like watching over. It's just the way that I see the world, and might not be very healthy, but so and then moving here, it just feels like it's too similar, it's the same kinds of issues. And so then, which is why the research interest and the work in our practice is really zooming out and looking at the entire sort of military apparatus between US, Israel, and Germany, which are kind of the most powerful militaries in the world, and the way in which they are essentially shaping the world map through this kind of forced displacements, through constant wars. Like the US has military bases in every single country in the world almost. And so, there's lily pad sites that sort of expand ideas of control. It's just not a question for me and my practice in that I have to practice in this way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for asking that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it has made sense to me as I've watched your practice develop. I mean, do you feel like there is any way, and maybe this is a question that everyone can respond to as well, but do you feel that there is anything you've observed in your home country or in other places in the world where there is a sense of, I guess I would say, progress towards dismantling, or is it always still a buildup? I mean, you know, Brian, you were talking about the surveillance cameras in London, and they just seem to proliferate, right? I mean, is anyone witnessing in any of the sites in which you guys work, with the dismantling of communism, for example, is anyone witnessing a backpedaling of surveillance, or is it all amping up? Changing?
I don't know. I haven't seen any change here about surveillance, other than the obvious things that people know what I'm shopping for online, because it just sort of pops up every time I don't buy it. It all constantly appears. But it is a very strange thing. I revisiting this stuff about Benthamite surveillance. I was a student at UCL and used to walk past Bentham's body, which was like a weird, one of the strangest bloody things that I still find it an uncanny kind of experience. And I always thought that his imprint on that city is, I can't think of someone who's imprinted their mentality on us. Maybe Gaudi in Barcelona, perhaps. But that Benthamite surveillance is everywhere in London. And it's really, really surprising to see the amount of cameras that are always trained upon you.
And do you think that people adjust their behavior in with respect to surveillance cameras, or with respect to the understanding that things are happening online in the same way that one might, or in any way, a comparable way to the way one might adjust one's behavior at a border? I mean, I was just in Tijuana the other day, and then you drive along the fence. There's another fence on the other side. There's a place for people to drive in between. But there's also, as you are moving around at night, there's also like major stadium lighting. You know, there's so, the apparatus of surveillance is so like thorough there. But do you believe, you guys, that people adjust their behavior in cities knowing that there's surveillance cameras? Is that as effective as a panopticon? As it were?
Well, I'd be interested in people's thoughts about that. I don't know the data on this. I just have to retreat to some kind of a priori reflection on it. My feeling personally is that this is an awfully guilty thing to say. I do feel like I behave at my best when I think somebody's watching me. This is sort of the intuition that Bentham would have. I suppose, I mean, I'm not pushing this so far. His thought would be, I think if everyone was constantly under watch, there wouldn't be prisons, because everyone would be so behaving at their best. You could get rid of incarceration at the cost of constantly being looked at. And then you get another kind of nightmare. So I don't know, we're in sort of weird territory in this area.
Yeah, the LAPD has an app called iWatch. Have you ever seen that?
No.
It's like the Apple I before the word watch. And it's so that you can report on people on the street, so that you can turn them in for, like, you know, oh, they were shopping for wires at Home Depot and it's suspicious for some reason or whatever. Very, very weird thing. I remember seeing it when I came back from Russia and being like, where am I?
But I think the relationship of one's behavior to surveillance has so much to do with who they are and how the law applies to them, you know. And so if you're untouchable by law, then it almost doesn't matter. But being of a specific sort of either minoritized or criminalized community, then I think it's very different, and it's always mediated by law, you know, and how that might kind of control bodies differently.
What about the 100-mile border zone? Are you aware of this bizarre thing? In case the rest of the audience isn't, it's like I think it's 1953 regulation that wasn't even voted on or anything. It was just 1953 regulation that the border of the United States extends, I think it's 100 miles, that's what it's called, into the country. And that, you know, the reality of what Border Patrol or police are allowed to do to you in terms of search and seizure is changed inside of that border. And I mean, that's like, 200 million people that live inside that extended border. And again, I suppose if you don't, if you aren't someone who might be picked up, it doesn't end up mattering. But if you are someone who might be picked up, it does. I don't think there's any movement on reversing that 1953 regulation because most people don't know about it, but it is definitely a very strange artifact of border policy.
Yeah, something that I wanted to say, that maybe is maybe related to that, but I think often I think about when you ask that question, and I think also when Brian brought up this question of behavior and being well behaved, I can't help but, I guess I had this internal curiosity around what it means to be well behaved. One, I have had a couple of occasions where I was working on things, and so I was crossing the border from Tijuana into the US, and I didn't have a purse at the time. I was just like walking with a wallet. I was crossing with the Sentry, which is like the trusted traveler program, right? So that means that the government already has all of this access to my information. I was just like literally walking across as like a woman, as a, like a Mexican presenting woman. And I have been like so incredibly interrogated. And I think I was actually like very well behaved in that. So I think to this point, right, that Ersela makes around who the law applies to, but I think what that opens up and what that creates for me as an interest because of my work and like because of being an artist is like the question of the kinds of performativity that then we see in response to those apparatus of surveillance, right? So the lies that will tell, so the misbehavior that takes place in those sites as a response of kind of self-protection, the lying and the artifice and the kind of like subterfuge that takes place where we perform an identity that we expect, like the kind of imperialist, like patriarchal, like white supremacist, right, like presentations of the nation state in that moment, all the things that are expected of us, because that might allow us to move across that border with more expediency and with more like safety. So I also think about how, I don't know if I agree that I behave better when I'm being watched, but I do know that I perform in accordance with like the expectations that are set around my subjectivity because I want to be safe and I don't want to be mistreated. And that also becomes a site of joy and a site of play and a site of resistance and resilience for communities, I think, to be able to exercise power in taking and stepping into this role of performativity potentially, right? I think this is a potential role of an agentic kind of site for that. So there's that.
Yeah, and I think it's disappointing when it doesn't even work. I mean, like, you can think that you're presenting. My mother was physically assaulted once at a border, even though she tried to wear a nice thing, it was something that she thought would make her look as if she had authority or something. But she was traveling with my little sister, or my older sister when she was young. And after being assaulted herself, they were turning to the child, and she said, "That's it," and she was able to stop further violence. But I mean, luckily, but she had tried to perform like, what she thought was acceptable in terms of her costume, and it hadn't worked. And I've had that experience as well on certain borders, not exactly that one, but just the disappointment that one's performance isn't actually functioning the way one wants it to. And then there is the surveillance in the city, and you can't really accommodate that, because if you want to do anything, what is an accommodation in daily life? It's very difficult to know. I think we only have a few more minutes, so if you have any questions for each other, please. But I definitely just wanted to give my students like one last chance at a leg up on the idea of a route to, you know, you in architecture or in design and in art, you guys in particular use very different strategies. You know, Ersela, you're talking about cataloging and open source, like creating access to that stuff for Amnesty and for other people online. And Amy, you guys are really humanizing and legitimizing, or like revealing the legitimacy of humans, human life. What are strategies that you think could augment those practices that you either do or don't have time for, or whatever? Like what kinds of steps do you think are good triggers for students to begin to think about this Imperial Valley, where they don't want an economy to develop around, per se, this detention center, and they're trying to begin to think about mapping around there to see what other kinds of lives are lived right now and could be lived? What would you say to them? Any words of wisdom?
Well, that's it's tough, really difficult question. But we had what we're finding out with our students teaching at different institutions around this context is that the more indirectly a question is formed, the more precisely then kind of things are uncovered. So some of our students have been interested in the wildlife that has been kind of smuggled across the border, and sort of exotic animals and exotic potions and that come from all over the world and move through this border, and how people are wearing exotic animals to smuggle, but then they get caught and then they can't be repatriated. So then what happens is that they're taken by US zoos as these like exotic expensive animals, but they're taken for free. And then there's like an entire sort of grant making kind of research proposal network that all these sort of American academics are benefiting from studying these animals. And so it's so like the capturing of the smuggling becomes a money-making scheme for biology, right? And so even though it doesn't seem to be related at all right away to the issues we're talking about, but to talk about, just to enter that conversation outside of the sort of like the known rhetoric through either sort of non-human species, or, you know, we're measuring dust and kind of like figuring out its DNA and where it's coming from. It seems like a richer kind of study. It has proven for us anyway, you know, to kind of uncover other aspects of this context.
Yeah, beyond the rhetoric. That's very helpful. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for coming. This was really interesting for me. And we'll see you guys next week, Thursday at 4 again for another one of these panels. It'll be in Spanish, with translation, I believe. I think everyone is speaking in Spanish, so we'll have translation service for our English speakers. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.